Hey students, I'm going to talk to you today about Karl Marx. And he was born in 1818 and died in 1883. He's a German philosopher of Jewish descent. His father was, I believe, a lawyer and wanted his son to not be held down by anti-Semitism in Germany. So the father had baptized Karl Marx in order to give him more entrance into society. Germany already had anti-Semitism, as many parts of Europe did in Russia and in France and in Germany. Anyway, so Karl Marx's father wanted to avoid any kind of setbacks that might impede his son Karl's progress. So he baptized him and tried to give him entry into German bourgeois life, sending to university and having him proceed as into becoming a lawyer, becoming affluent. There's an old joke that says, show me a Jew who's not a lawyer and I'll show you a doctor. Anyway, I'll start my comments about Karl Marx from an experience that I had as a student in college. And I remember coming home one day from Berkeley. I went to LA to see my mother, and I came home with a t-shirt that had this image, right? Everybody's heard of Che Guevara, Ernesto Guevara, the Argentinian revolutionary. And I came back from having bought a t-shirt on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley. Some of you go to Cal, you know that the main street going into Cal is Telegraph. And so I bought a shirt there. Came home for Christmas, I'm sure, and I had that t-shirt on. I didn't know what it meant. It just looked kind of like some kind of Rage Against the Machine type of image. And, you know, you're rebellious as a teenager, college student. And my mother said in Spanish, "Te hiciste comunista." In Spanish, you became a communist. She was really fearful that her son had lost his way and become a communist. I didn't even have any idea of what it meant. I thought Che was Mexican. Didn't even know anything about his political views. Anyway, so I've remedied that since when I became a philosophy professor, to learn a little bit about Karl Marx, to learn a little bit about Che Guevara, and all this stuff we call revolution and communism and capitalism. Because if there's any one philosopher that really touches on something that you and I deal with every day, it's our economic and social life. We can't get away from that. We're not thinking about Plato and his divine ideas. We're not really thinking too much on the level of just pure abstract metaphysics, the way Descartes was when he was wondering whether he exists or not and whether his mind is in contact with the world. Those are kind of abstract concepts. Marx is dealing with economics, and so his analysis is weighty and it impacts our lives. But before I start talking a little bit more about Marx, I should mention that we have in the United States a lot of elements of socialism within our country right now. And just so that I can make a quick statement about socialism, because many of us, when we're in college, we don't even, I mean, we know a little bit about capitalism. We know it's about markets and exchanging, and, you know, you're trying to pull yourself up, and commodities, and, you know, buying and selling. We know some aspects about capitalism because that's the system that we're in. But when we talk about communism or socialism, you know, we've heard of these terms, but we really don't know much about it. And socialism, just briefly, is basically when a country has state-run industry or state-run infrastructure. For instance, the state or the government could be Norway, it could be Sweden, it could be Finland, it could be Greenland, elements of Switzerland or Germany or Japan or Canada. Many modern countries have elements of socialism, and it's when the government basically runs an industry or infrastructure, like the highway system. It's not owned privately by rich entrepreneurs who own the freeway, like 125 and toll roads. We have some private ownership of freeways. But socialism is when the government creates an entity, like what we've done in the United States, the Caltrans system. Caltrans, you'll see these guys in orange vests that say Caltrans. Well, that's an element of a government agency that runs the freeway construction and freeway maintenance. So you'll see these people with big cranes and heavy lifting material and asphalt machines and bulldozers and cranes. They're doing a lot of stuff there by UCSD, and they were widening the 805 right there by the exit for the H Street exit. So that's all run by Caltrans. That's a government-run agency or an industry. And so socialism, whether it's in the United States or in other countries, basically is when the government, not private enterprise, is running some kind of part of the economy, the infrastructure. So it could run the post office. Some countries will have a socialized post office, or they might have socialized education. For instance, in the United States, we have something called socialized education. It's called public school. I mean, even the name, public school, social school. So the United States has a lot more in common with socialism than many of us ever think. And yet, when my mother saw this image of Che on my t-shirt, she was absolutely freaked out. There's other elements of socialism in the United States right now, too. And in case I didn't quite finish the idea about socialism, let's talk about it in other parts of the world. It's when the government is running infrastructure, some kind of resource that needs to be handled by the state. For instance, water allocation, or electricity, or the airport system, or the transportation system, or medicine, education, those kind of industries. Typically, we tend to think of socialism in Europe, maybe in some parts of South America. We never really want to think about it here in the United States, but it is here. And I can give you a lot of other elements besides public schools or the post office. For instance, we have Caltrans, as I was mentioning, but we also have the Helix Water District. That's a government-run industry, and it's basically the way we've organized the allocation of a resource, infrastructure, water delivery, sewer, waste management, or wastewater management. And instead of being run by private industry, it's run by a government industry. Our taxes that they collect from us, whether on property taxes or whether we buy a big gulp at 7-Eleven, those taxes go to Sacramento, or they go to the county if they're kept locally here, and then they're redistributed to these agencies so that they can provide a public service. The fire department is basically a socialized entity. A lot of people say, what do you mean it's socialized entity? They get paid, of course. They have a salary. The police captain makes good money. They have wages. They have unions. But the money that provides for the fire department is coming from tax money. And that's the same thing that they do over in Sweden, or in Germany, or in Norway, or in Japan. So the fire department, like I said, public schools. We have Social Security. What's Social Security? Which was established in 1935 by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. It's basically they take money out of our income, and it's put aside into a big trust fund and then allocated out to people as they retire. The typical retirement age in the United States is about 67. I'll get Social Security in another couple of years. Or if, for instance, I died, my wife would get a small amount, residual amount of my Social Security until she died. That money is collected socially and put into a trust fund. And listen to the word, or the title, Social Security. So am I convincing you that many of these elements that we tend to think of as being fearful or maybe something that's dangerous, we actually have incorporated many of these things within our own United States hybrid economy. And I'm going to call it a hybrid economy. We aren't just free enterprise like Pepsi versus Coke, or UPS versus, FedEx, or, Amazon Prime. Those are competitive things, Burger King against In-N-Out. Those are competitive industries. So we do have free enterprise. But we also have a lot of social things, like in terms of our water, electricity, police departments, even community college where you go to school is state funded. I mean, imagine you pay about $150 for this 3-unit class. $150? Come on. How much would it cost you if you went to a for-profit university like National University, or if you went to a completely private school like USD, how much would this class cost? It wouldn't cost $150. So anyway, and so it's state subsidized education. San Diego State University is heavily subsidized by the state. That's why it's called State University. It's heavily subsidized by the part of the California as a state. Okay, so I've made my point. And we have Medicare, we have Medi-Cal, we have after-school programs. I mean, the United States has tons of social services that are not just free market. They take our tax money and provide a service. And so let's try to think about Marx through the lens of someone who wanted to get away from the worst parts of dog-eat-dog capitalism and try to see an economy that would provide for people's needs and not exploit them. So instead of seeing Karl Marx as this horrible revolutionary, I mean, he wasn't in favor of revolution. He was a dangerous person for the times. He wanted to overthrow aristocracies and capitalists who had control of all industries and comprised a very top small percent of the people in France or in the United States or in Germany or in Britain or in the Russian aristocracy. I mean, he knew of aristocracies that controlled land and resources and livestock and, the emerging industries such as coal and steel and iron and all of that kind of stuff. He saw all of that in the Industrial Revolution, and he was trying to come up with something that was a little bit more humane because he saw a really, really ugly element of dog-eat-dog capitalism in the mid 1800s going into the late 1800s, and he saw it. It was frightening. So Karl Marx's experience comes out of the Industrial Revolution of seeing children, working at the age of 7 for 15, 16 hours. He saw workers that had no unions, that didn't have any rehabilitation or vocational services offered to them if they ever got their arm chopped off in some kind of sawmill or some textile mill, or if a train ran over them, or if they got burned. There was no kind of rehabilitation services, no maternity leave. There was no child labor laws. There was no minimum wage. There was no holiday or overtime pay, no sexual harassment policy. There was none of those modern protections that you see that modern capitalism in the last 60, 70 years has introduced into the workforce, allowing unions and allowing, OSHA requirements for safety. You have to walk around with headgear and goggles and steel-toed boots. All of those worker protections have only come in recently because capitalism in the first world, not in the third world. In Mexico, imagine what workers still are exposed to all the time, or in China. But in the first world, capitalism has adapted more and given people overtime and days off and holidays and vacations, maternity leaves, and child support and all these kind of things. So capitalism has kind of adapted in the first world, and recently, only in the last 60, 70 years. But in the third world, it's still the horrific face of capitalism is still very present. But Marx was looking at the really ugly form of capitalism. And so the first point that I want to talk to you about, now that I've kind of talked to you a little bit and kind of brought down your fear level a little bit of socialism, because we certainly have a lot of that in the United States, and it's present in many countries throughout the world, right? In Canada and Costa Rica and Switzerland and many other places. But the first thing to talk about with Marx, and I'm kind of referring to the reading that you guys have. Let me see if I can find the front page here. You guys, I asked you to read not from the book, the Palmer book, not from Donald Palmer, Looking at Philosophy, but the Karl Marx article is coming from Canvas, and I hope that you guys got my announcement to make sure that your homework and this lecture is going to be based on this article that I just showed you and not from the reading that comes from Palmer. I don't find the Palmer reading particularly helpful. So the first concept that you will see in the Canvas reading that I was talking to you about right here, Karl Marx, sorry guys, is economic determinism, and that's really on the first page of this article, page 174. And what he means The first concept, economic determinism, is that for Karl Marx, I'll just give you the quote, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, rather their social existence that determines their consciousness. So I'm going to read it again. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. So we are products of the environment that create us. So if you live in a hood, and if it's really, really bullets are flying, people are dying hood, not just kind of like a middle class kind of hood, but something was really, really, impacted wherever you grow up. If it's really, really heavy police presence and drugs and gang violence, stuff that you might even see in Tijuana or in places where it's really, really, there's a real criminal element that exists. If you see kind of that, and if you're a product of that, you have what Marx would call your social consciousness is developed by all those impacts. Consequently, if you are from Del Mar or Coronado or La Jolla or Encinitas, you have bourgeois consciousness. We call it bougie, bougie consciousness. So we are products. Our social existence is going to determine our consciousness. And so people who come from their environments largely are products of their environment. Now, are there people in the hood who are going to ballet and playing the violin? Hell yeah. And they're singing opera, of course. But are there a lot of people in the hood engaged in dog eat dog? I've got to survive because I don't have a dad. I don't have any kind of access or way out of this environment that I'm in. Yeah. And there's that too. So we are products of our environment. And Marx says that our consciousness is going to be developed by the social environment that we come out of. So if you're Paris Hilton, you have Paris Hilton consciousness. If you're Tupac, you have Tupac or hood consciousness. I'm not trying to, be too stereotypical there, but you know what I mean. You have Kim Kardashian consciousness. Anyway, so that's one of the main things that Karl Marx talks about. Okay, another concept I want to talk to you about is that, and I'll try to tie all these concepts together as you see Karl Marx's penetrating analysis of capitalism and his suggestion about socialism and communism. So anyway, a next idea that you'll see in this reading, in the Canvas reading, is that Marx talks about the foundation and the superstructure. So you'll see, and I'll mention it actually with some kind of like little graphic that I'll put up, that Marx sees that if you look at a capitalist society, if you look at a capitalist economy, at the very basic part of the economy, and I want you to think of it as a triangle. So at the very bottom of the capitalist economy, you will find the means of production. The means of production. You'll hear this whenever you're talking about people who really know about Marx, okay? The means of production. So what is Marx referring to in a capitalist society by the means of production? He's talking about all the natural resources that a society has at its disposal. So if you are from a country that has no running water, all your forests have been chopped down, and there's very little agriculture or livestock, your means of, and you don't have any rivers or oceans, your means of production are very limited because there's very few natural resources for your country to be based on. Now notice in Saudi Arabia, if you look at a drone shot of Saudi Arabia, you wouldn't really see much from the air, but large, arid, dry spaces that doesn't look like they produce very much life. But what's underneath the sand? Oil. And you cannot put a price on that, right? So their means of production doesn't show up in unlimited natural resources like you'll see in the United States or in Mexico and Canada, which has timber and has livestock and buffalo and cattle and pigs and chickens and soybeans and corn and wheat. And we have, so much in the United States in agriculture and all these kinds of things that we produce in the United States. We have oceans, lobster, and we have shrimp, bubblegum shrimp, and we have, so much in our coastal waters and salmon. I mean, we're teeming with life. Certainly 50 or 60 years ago, I mean, look how pristine the country probably really was. Mexico is teeming with life and abundance. Canada has a lot, timber, resources, silver, gold, iron, coal, salt, minerals, silica. The United States has a lot. So we have a lot of things that are going into our means of production. And Marx also thinks part of the means of production is the technology that you have to get to those means of production. Because let's say that you live in a country that is very rich or very rich in resources, but your country hasn't ever really been, it hasn't developed itself yet. It doesn't have oil derricks and oil drills. Well, those countries, if they find oil, they don't have any technology, so they're going to have to go to a first world country and find a British or a Canadian or United States drilling platform to get down, because they have rich natural resources as part of their means of production, but they don't have a whole lot of technology. Usually, though, once you have rich natural resources or means of production, you start investing in getting the tools to get those the technology so that you can harvest all of those natural resources. Okay, so that's the one basic level of the foundation of a society. I think I said it was the foundation of a society. We'll talk about the superstructure in a minute. The next level in that triangle is the relations of production. And so here's where Marx is talking about the social classes that are produced by one's position in the economy. So let's put it to you, let's make it kind of simple, because Marx didn't do us a favor by using a very user-friendly expression here when he talks about the relations of production. What the heck does that mean? It just means, what position do you occupy in your economy, in the economy? So if you are a janitor and you're working at Qualcomm, or if you're working at some biotech company, but all you do is to empty the trash, who are your social classes? Who are your relations of production? Well, other people that are probably in the working class or in the service economy, people that work in fast foods and stuff. So your relations of production are kind of the social classes that you're exposed to due to your position in the economy. So if you work in fast food, are you hanging around with entrepreneurs? Are you hanging around with college presidents, lawyers, marketing people, biotech people, people working on the cure for the coronavirus? Are you working in Silicon Valley if you're a mechanic down in the South Bay and you change mufflers? Doesn't mean you can't have money, but it just means that your social classes, you're going to be into the area of wherever your social classes are. Your relations of production are going to come from the social class that you're in based on your position in the economy. How much do you own? What can you do in the economy? Your social class is going to be developed. Your hood, your neighborhood is going to be developed by what your position is in the economy. How much money do you make? Well, how much money you make is going to say who the people that you're hanging around with. When Zion Williamson or LeBron gets, when I don't know where Zion's from originally, probably from the Carolinas or something. He went to Duke. I don't know exactly where he's from, but LeBron from Akron, Ohio, he doesn't hang around there anymore. I'm sure he's got places all over the world, but he probably lives in LA. And so you can see that he doesn't hang around people from the hood anymore. It's very unusual. Marshawn Lynch, who came from Oakland, the city that I'm from, he still goes back to Oakland all the time, and he has houses in Oakland, and he has a lot of his own business in Oakland because he's like true to his hood. So, but that's unusual, because most people, their social classes start changing because they have a different position in the economy. Their social relations change. So their relations of production, again, it's kind of a confusing term, but their relationships change. When Kevin Durant came over to the Golden State Warriors, he immediately started, with all that money he was getting from Golden State, he went immediately and started meeting people in Silicon Valley, just about 30 or 40 miles south of the Bay Area, in Los Gatos and stuff like that. So, he certainly isn't hanging around with people anymore from where he came from in Baltimore, Maryland. So, he really got out of the hood. Okay, so I made my point. Now, the third part of this pyramid is called the superstructure, and that's one of the most important parts of this whole capitalist economic analysis that Marx brings to bear, because the top part of that triangle is the superstructure. And this is all the non-material elements of a society. Now, that doesn't make much sense, right? The non-material, it's the mental things, the ideas that make a society run. And those ideas are put to us in the media. Those ideas are given to us in the education system. Those ideas come to us from our parents, from the ideology of the country, from religion, from art. Those are all the things that feed our head, that tell us that we should think a certain way. So check this out. This is what's happening in our modern world. And you guys all know you're 18, 19, 20. You're starting to come of age. But you know that just recently, a couple of months ago, Bernie Sanders was in a really tough, Democratic nomination race with Joseph Biden. Now, he didn't win, but he won a lot of states in the early primaries. And he was doing pretty well. And so what we're seeing is that what Bernie Sanders shows is that now the typical ideology that we've all been given as people in the United States, which says capitalism and competition and free markets and all of these kind of ideological ideas that come to us from the media, from education, even from our parents, from memes, from all these sources, the stuff that gets into our head, we're starting to challenge some of that. The superstructure in the United States is starting to be challenged even by millennials, and by millennials who are starting to question so many things about, the environment, about how to eat, about the families that we should be forging, about so many things that are up in the air, about relationships. Notice how even when I came out of, the 70s and 80s, and, I was still, even though I was kind of young enough to be influenced by the counterculture, I was from the Bay Area, the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s, I was still very much steeped in my Mexican-American heritage. My parents are from Mexico. My mother's from Guanajuato. My father's from Mexico City. I was still very much steeped in Catholicism. The superstructure of religion and United States ideology was still very much a part of me. And then Vietnam happened. And people like me coming into our teenage years started to go, I'm wondering if what people are saying about the United States is that we're an empire, that we have a lot of elements of militarism. Well, once you start mentioning things like militarism and asking questions like, are we an empire? You can start to see that those are questions that are not typical of the kind of thing. Those questions show that you're starting to question the ideas that you have been given by the superstructure, because the superstructure is going to be the ideas that come from corporations, from institutions. Even schools kind of foster kind of traditional kind of thinking. They basically tell you how many places have you gone to school that say you should challenge everything? In anthropology class, are you getting things that should make you challenge the social structure the way a Che Guevara would challenge economic thinking? And if you are getting that, I bet you're getting that more from the internet and from memes and from your friends who can't make it in the economy anymore, who are getting $20 and $30 and $40,000 a year jobs, and they're challenging the superstructure. It's not that people who are representing corporate ideas and educational ideas like me, I'm still very much a part of the system. But your generation, and even with this Bernie Sanders, and he's not the only one, Greta Thunberg, there's this whole generation of people that are thinking about, a different alternative lifestyle, a more green lifestyle, a more healthy lifestyle, even as the planet is dying on many levels. But your generation is challenging the superstructure. And those of you who got mothers that want you to be daughters that have children and bring them grandchildren, if you're starting to think, nah, I'm not thinking that, even if you were born in Mexico and you've got parents from the Philippines or wherever your family of origin is from, you'll notice that now that you're in the United States, there's this whole revolutionary idea coming on in terms of eating, dressing, tattoos, body piercing, ideas that are starting to come to you that are challenging the superstructure, which wants to make you a product, which wants to turn you into a consumer. Now, if that works for you, fine, but just be aware that that's what the superstructure wants to do. And even me, as part of the education system, I'm part of that superstructure too. When you read somebody like Marx, though, you start to say, wow, I should challenge that superstructure. I should challenge that thinking, at least give it critical attention. So you can see how Marx is kept out of your education system. It's amazing that you are 18, 19, and 20 and you don't know anything about Che. I'm talking about Che, C-H-E. Che Guevara. You've seen the icon, you've seen his image, but you don't know anything about him. Neither did I as 18 or 19. Why? Because I'm a product of the superstructure, an American superstructure, which even back in the 70s was controlling my brain, just like it's continuing to control your brain. But you guys have rap, you guys have lyrics, you have artists that are challenging all of that convention, all of those conventions, sexually, morally. Some of those conventions need to be challenged, but some of them maybe need to be upheld on some other levels too. That's where your critical thinking comes into view. Maybe you want tradition. Maybe you want a capitalistic job. Maybe you want to, increase, but just be aware that there are other voices out there that are asking questions and challenging the superstructure. I mentioned this other thing about dialectical materialism. I don't think I mentioned that so much as one of the questions that you should answer in the how I have questions associated with all of these readings. I don't know that I asked you this particular thing, but let me mention something about it because it's mentioned in this reading, and it is a key Marxist concept: dialectical materialism. I mean, it sounds frightening. Dialectical materialism. Doesn't that sound like a typical kind of philosophical concept that's frightening? But anyway, Marx is a philosopher. Before he got into economics, and journalism, and writing, his main focus was philosophy. He was a philosophy major at the University of Bonn, B-O-N-N, in Germany. And he studied philosophy, and he came under the influence of a German philosopher, Hegel, H-E-G-E-L, Hegel. And Hegel taught that all of history was basically a series of synthesis, antithesis, and then new synthesis. So at any point in history, you have one dominant idea. Let me do it this way. I always see the camera in reverse. One dominant idea against another dominant idea that then starts to yield to another idea. That's the conflict of history. So let me give it to you. You can see it in economics. For instance, you have taxis. Taxis basically have this control over movement of people, that come into an airport, and then it's the taxi system, and that leads to a certain monopoly of how rides are going to be offered. Then you have this thing called Uber. That's the antithesis, and so now you have this new synthesis, and out of that, other people start getting, oh man, I'm going to do Lyft, and then a new kind of paradigm is developed. You had Blockbuster Video, and then all of a sudden you started things on the horizon. Man, if we'd only bought stock and things like this, Netflix, which can deliver a movie right to your home, stream the movie right to you over the internet. But I remember going to Blockbuster Video. Some of you remember your parents going and getting those big old VHS tapes, but they always had to bring them back and pay late fees. Well, on an economic kind of level, you can see how there's an idea followed by another idea, and then it leads to a new synthesis. So we see that in economics all the time. We see it in history. And I saw that when I was young, and I mentioned to you, in the countercultural revolution of the 1960s and 70s, of which I was just a young teenager looking at that kind of stuff. So you had typical Mad Men mentality of people like Don Draper, who, the idea of men in the 50s was to climb the corporate ladder, to have yourself an old-fashioned, to have a Manhattan, to kind of lord it over women, to read Playboy magazine, to climb the corporate ladder so that you could be kind of like a Hugh Hefner. I'm the lord of the mansion, have a little electric knife, cut the ham, cut the, turkey at Thanksgiving, have, kind of like a 401k, and retire comfortably with a gold watch. That was the mentality of men in the 1950s. Then all of a sudden you had beatniks and people starting to, the folk movement in the early 1960s, and rock and roll and drugs all of a sudden came in, and men were starting to say, nah, I'm not going to wear my hair short, and I'm going to have an earring, and I'm going to have facial hair. And that explosion led to, and the civil rights movement was feeding that even before in the 1950s. You had people challenging militarism and racism and sexism, and then all of a sudden you had indigenous movements of American Indians reclaiming their identities. And then you had the whole sexual revolution that came out and women's movement that came out. So what happened? You had what Hegel would be talking about. The one part of history is leading to kind of like stagnation, and then all of a sudden another movement in history is the antithesis. So you have thesis, antithesis, leading to a new synthesis, and you still see that countercultural movement playing itself out now. You guys are the second generation since my generation, and you guys are still doing that. Male and female roles have suddenly so changed, much more free in terms of your body expressions, like body art and stuff like that. So you guys are taking that to the next generation. And with your iPhones and technology, self-expression is even, becoming even more prevalent. You can make your own music, make your own ideas, your own, videos. And so that all started from the countercultural revolution of the 1960s. So that's what Hegel was talking about, that history is. The dynamic between one historical idea and another historical idea, which leads to a new synthesis. Well, Marx, as a philosopher, he liked that kind of analysis, the synthesis, antithesis, and then the new synthesis. And he saw that in history, if you look at economics, you'll see that at the very beginning of society, we had primitive communism. That's how we all started. When we were out on the Serengeti plain in Africa and collecting roots and, learning how to hunt and gathering tools and learning, how to trap animals and, dig for things and find things that we could eat and, stuff that we could use. That was kind of a period of primitive communism. That was the first synthesis. Then you had the antithesis coming, where people started to grow things in agricultural settings. So they started growing seeds and stuff. And now you have the hunter-gatherer society being challenged by big cities. And so now that led to empire. And so now these cities that could grow seeds and stuff and build walls around their camps to protect their agriculture, right? So now you have a city being developed, and now you have rulers that are coming in, and so now you have empire. And so the next generation would be that the empire, the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, is going to be challenged by people who are being dominated by those empires, slaves that are being taken captive. And so you have new movements that lead to another movement in history. I'm not going to make this too involved because, Marx is a historical, economic, social, cultural thinker. And so we're looking at almost the whole of human consciousness and human development in actual time as it expresses itself in economics. And so I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but we've had various, synthesis. Eventually, as society kept moving on, we got this period where we're in now, where capitalism became the new synthesis, capitalism, but then it was being challenged by new worker movements. People who said, well, I don't want to work for you anymore. I want to have my own, the bourgeoisie. So you had capitalist movement, which he called bourgeois democracies. And then you had bourgeois people who were merchants, and they were saying, I'm not going to work for you anymore. I have my own money and title and stuff like that. So now you're leading, and capitalism had this really ugly element too, in which it really exploited people too. So anyway, out of the exploitation of capitalism is coming this new evolutionary and synthesis, which is, for Marx, communism or socialism. In other words, people are going to get tired of the contradiction of seeing a capitalist system that exploits people, alienates people, keeps bringing wages down, harms the ecology, and basically puts us in such a competitive situation. I mean, look at all the stress that you or I are under. I mean, I raised two sons. My sons just got out of San Diego State, in 2019. And my sons, I can see, heavily impacted by, their whole progress through this capitalist system, applying for FAFSA and trying to get scholarships, and then trying to get internships, trying to get jobs, resumes. I mean, this system that constantly, puts us on a treadmill. And look how many of us, suffer, insomnia or, obsessive thoughts or stuff. We need to vape. We need to, relieve anxiety and stuff like that. And we do. And that's why a lot of our behavior goes against, like Aristotle, who's always talking to us about being moderate and being virtuous in all of our dispositions in our mind and in our body. We have to be moderate with those kind of things. But, Aristotle wasn't living in a capitalistic competitive society where we're being told, hey, if you don't produce, if you don't outwork somebody, then somebody from Iran, somebody from China, somebody from India who's working 18 or 19 hours a day on the computer, learning math, learning engineering, is going to outsource you and outwork you because he can put in all his work virtually or her work virtually. So that's the message that you got, and that's capitalism. And some of you can adapt, and a lot of us are going to be thrown to the side by capitalism. And that's what Marx was seeing, is that, man. So he saw a couple of other ideas that you'll see in the reading. Alienation. Very, very briefly, alienation is what happens to us in a capitalist type of system in which our labor is just being used. When you work at a hotel and you come in and you just kind of put in all the linens on the tablecloth and set up the candles and the plates and everything. If you're in fast foods, you're just constantly being worked to put out hamburgers or wherever you're working. People in Mexico are working at Samsung and maquiladoras, repetitive business, on an assembly line, which you're just being used as kind of a machinery to pump out products. And you're doing that because you have no hope. You have no identification with your product. In the past, people made saddles, people made boots, people made leatherware, people made earrings, people made eyeglasses, people made all kinds of things. We were craftspeople, men and women, but that was all replaced by factories. And Marx is looking at all of that and saying that is very, very alienating, and that creates alienation for people in modern societies. And that's why people, when they live in poor countries and they see that they'll never be a part of the 1%, they'll never be a part of the ruling class, they'll never have the education access to become somebody in marketing or in accounting or in the legal department or in human resources. They'll never be able to do that. You can see how they will turn to revolution. They either turn to not criminology, they'll either turn to crime. And that's why in third world countries, cocaine and meth and all that kind of stuff, narcotráfico becomes so prevalent because there's no access for people unless they belong to the small little 1% or the top 10% that can go to college. And so you can see why either crime will appeal to many, many people in many, many parts of the world, or revolutionary ideas that will appeal. And that's why Marx never really loses his appeal. That's why you have Marxist guerrillas in Colombia, why you have Marxist guerrillas in Peru, the Sendero Luminoso, why you have Marxist guerrillas in Indonesia, why you have Marxist guerrillas, I'm talking about 2020, where you have Marxist guerrillas in Chiapas, why you have Marxist guerrillas in the Philippines, in Cebu, in Luzon. You have Marx will never go out of style as long as brutal capitalism exists, which exploits and alienates people, because people will always want a better life. So you can see that Marx was trying to address people's fundamental, identity and their ability to be able to feed themselves and to be able to find themselves in an economy which increasingly leaves so many people out because education creates so much debt. And even when you get an education, what's left for you or I, if we don't have a real specific set of skills or just special talents which enable us to use our own marketing skills to become a YouTuber, to develop our own markets or food or products or some other things that you can develop, buying and selling. That still can be done. But you have to have talent and you have to have skill and you certainly have to have focus. And a lot of us, we're already dealing with a lot of trauma, just having gone through our families of origin, which were dealing with economic systems based on an American kind of situation. Are people as stressed in Canada? Just a couple of questions. Are people as stressed in Norway? Are people as stressed in Sweden? Are people as stressed in Greenland or in Switzerland? They have economic systems that have capitalism, but they have a lot of social structures that allow people to go to school and to keep out of debt, to keep them out of the prison industrial complex. Notice, if you can't go to school, if you don't have the access, what are you going to do? Well, that's why we have 2.5 million people in prison. 2.5 million people in prison. That's why we have so many people living underneath the freeway. They think there's 9,000 homeless people in San Diego City. We're not even talking about in, throughout the whole county, like in Chula Vista or in Spring Valley where I live. We're talking about in San Diego City. People come from Switzerland or Canada and they look at our underpasses and they look at this whole tent city phenomenon and they're going, man, they just wouldn't expect to see that type of alienation. That's one of the consequences of capitalism. And Marx was certainly seeing that back in the 1850s and 60s. And it was even worse then because, there was no access for people except through factories or unless you were already part of the bourgeoisie and that rich upper class. That should be another thing that I mentioned is, and Marx has the two groups or the two classes that are pitted together classically in the whole Marxist economy. I should have mentioned this earlier, or the bourgeois, the people who are the bougies, the bourgeoisie, that's that class, and then the proletariat. They're in constant class conflict with each other, right? The haves and the have-nots. And I think the one last thing that you'll see in the reading is the theory of surplus value. And this is where Marx's economy is, or his economic analysis is really good because he says, when people make something, they put their product, they put their value into it. So I can't really show you something that I can show you as a product that shows labor intensive stuff. But let me just use something that I just have in my expo. Here's a bowl, a ceramic bowl. Now, who knows where this bowl was made? I'm going to go ahead and say it was made in China. Okay, so, probably made for somebody who's making pennies on the dollar. But anyway, Marx would say that the theory of surplus value is that when a worker puts something of their labor into a product, there's a value that's created in that product. So the company that is selling this bowl and sells it at Costco or wherever we bought this for, let's say, $59 because you were able to buy 8 bowls and 8 glasses and 8 plates and 8 salad plates, $59 or whatever that was retail for. But there was a worker who was able to generate for that company $59 or $60, but that worker only made a couple of pennies for the dollar. Marx sees the distance between what a product is selling for and what the product was produced for. That difference is called surplus value. And Marx thinks that the worker should receive more value for the product that he or she made because look at how much profit was made in that product. Now, obviously, this is an inflated product. By the time it gets to Costco, you had to pay transportation costs and you have to pay marketing costs. And maybe if it was sent across the United States, across the Pacific Ocean from China, that it's not $59. This company in China probably sold it for $20. But still, if it sold it for $20 before it finally get to Costco, the worker still produced, 200% of, markup value from what they put into it. So anyway, whatever the markup value is, the markup ratio. So in other words, and Marx thinks that it's exploitative of capitalism not to reward, to give back some of that surplus value to the worker. And that's what creates so much instability in the world. And that's why Marx was so dedicated to the idea of bringing in a better system. Now, he didn't really know what a new socialist system should look like. Marx is a great critic, but he's not very good at providing us what the details should be about what a socialist or a communist society should look like. But there is one example in history which is really interesting that we can kind of see what Marx might have been hinting out, but who knows? I mean, Marx died in 1883. When Che came to power, when he came to power as an Argentinian revolutionary who went to Cuba to help Fidel Castro fight a revolution against a dictator, Bautista, Fulgencio Bautista, when he was a dictator, when they finally overthrew him on December 8th, 1959, I think it was, no, January 8th, 1959, when Fidel and Che came to power in Cuba, their question was, all right, we're Marxists, and they didn't admit that openly because they didn't want the United States to invade them right away. They kind of played their cards very close. They just said, hey, we had a revolution because we had a dictator and he was killing people and imprisoning people and throwing, and targeting people. And this was a brutal dictatorship. Even John F. Kennedy said that, he had never seen, John F. Kennedy, an American president, said that he had never seen so much exploitation as what he saw in Cuba. And it's interesting because Kennedy even made a statement about Cuba that he was in favor of Castro's revolution in 1959. He was in favor with their proclamation that they made from a mountain range, the Sierra Maestra, where Fidel basically said, this is what I'm wanting to do. I wanted to throw out a dictator in favor of a new people's nationalist society. But Che and Fidel didn't want to come out and say that they were Marxist. He didn't want Eisenhower, the president of the United States at the time, to come in and invade and throw out the revolution right away. So they played it cool. But eventually, they started to decide, what kind of economy can we produce here in Cuba now that we've thrown off Bautista and all of his associations with the United States and how they exploited the workers down here, the hotels, the gambling, the Cuban tobacco industry. All of it was exploited by first world companies and first world countries, especially the United States. So Fidel and Castro were trying to, and I'm not going to make them saints, but their idea was, what should we do? So they in fact were trying to reinterpret. They had seen what the Soviet Union had done, trying to incorporate socialism. They had seen what China had tried to do under Mao. They had seen, but they wanted to have their own kind of people's revolution. So they thought, well, whatever revolution we have, we need to see what our means of production are, right? Remember the idea? We need to see what our economy can sustain. What do the people of Cuba have that they can sell as part of their infrastructure, as part of their means of production? And I'm going to show y'all. Yeah, this is not one of those big, thick, Cuban cigars that you can say, I can't smoke them. They're too tiring. Can't go through a whole cigar. But I like these little demis. And this is what Fidel and what Che kind of figured that they needed to do. So they wanted to nationalize their industry so that it wouldn't be dominated by some kind of blood-sucking capitalist, and socialize them so that the ownership of the means of production would not be owned by somebody who's part of the ruling class, but the actual workers of Cuba. So the workers of Cuba were trying to determine their own destiny. They did that with sugarcane. They did that with the rum industry. They tried to do that with tourism, but nobody wanted to go and visit Cuba after the revolution, even though they weren't against foreign investment in the Cuban Revolution, but the United States saw them as they started to move towards socialism. They marginalized them and they tried to sabotage. I mean, you'll never hear this very much because you'll always look at Fidel Castro as this absolute dictator. But if you really look, and this is part of the superstructure and the brainwashing that goes on, if you look at how Cuba is perceived in the world, many countries really, really like what Cuba tried to do, even when they tried to resist, sabotage of their economy for year after year after year after the Cuban Revolution. There were American planes that would fly over and seed Monsanto products that were trying to kill and deforest their crops. And that was being done by flying out of New Orleans, Louisiana, and in and Florida. The not so much the Eisenhower administration, but the Kennedy administration. And here he was kind of playing both sides. He's kind of saying, yeah, I admire Fidel Castro's, proclamation of independence for Cuba. But on the other hand, he's sponsoring the CIA to go ahead and, do all these aggression against Cuba. So anyway, so Cuba tried to survive even while it was being undermined by the United States, who did not want to see a successful a successful socialist revolution in this Western hemisphere. They didn't want to see that, because what would have happened if Mexico had seen a really good example of a socialist system that was starting to work in Cuba? Could it be that the United States feared that Mexico would get rid of its long-standing association with the United States? And then in Costa Rica, and then in Nicaragua, which had banana plantations owned by the Dole, the Dole plantation. They had pineapples, coffee growers in Nicaragua, as I said, and in El Salvador, and all those Central American, they call them banana republics. So yeah, the United States was trying to do everything that it could to undermine the new socialist system that Cuba was developing. Did Cuba declare war on the United States after they won their independence from a cruel dictator? Did they declare war on the United States? No, but they knew war was coming against them because they did not want a Yankee-styled North American controlled system of their own economy. They wanted to determine their own means of production. And why shouldn't they have been able to do that? Doesn't the United States represent, with the United States, with the United Nations, the free sovereignty of another country? They certainly didn't represent, they didn't do that in Cuba, and we ended up driving Cuba deeper into the Soviet Union and to the People's Republic of China, which is exactly what happened. In order for them to survive, they had to make more and more concessions with Russia so that Russia would provide them arms, military training, nukes, for their protection, because at any one point Cuba felt that it was going to be invaded. So is that a failure of the socialist system? Because many elements of socialism work in Europe. If you think about it, doesn't Norway work with a very hybrid system of, private enterprise, but also a lot of state-controlled industry? Many of their industries are state-controlled, and yet they have a good standard of living in Norway. Why couldn't we have allowed that to happen in a country that was only 90 miles away from Florida? Why didn't we let that happen in Cuba? Why did we limit trade and have an embargo against them, even while they were trying to do an incredible job at providing literacy for their largely indigenous population, which was illiterate and underfed and malnourished? They had horrible medical needs. And if you look at Cuba today, even in their poverty, even with all this isolation that the United States is trying to force on them, and we even punished other countries for dealing with them, for buying their tobacco and buying their sugar cane. We've tried to marginalize them. You can see, if you ever look at things in Cuba, they can't even buy import cars. They have all 1956, 57, 58 Chevys. After the Cuban Revolution came to power in 59, you couldn't get an American automobile there. And so they have to keep fixing their American cars that are kind of frozen in time. It's incredible. And somehow the Cuban Revolution has survived. Not perfectly, but you have to remember there's been ongoing aggression against Cuba since it declared its independence on January 8, 1959. So what happened? Cuba wanted to sell its tobacco to the United States. It wanted to sell its sugar to the United States. It loved American baseball. Cuba would have loved to have a baseball league. Fidel Castro he loved Hollywood. He loved all the stars from the 1960s, Marilyn Monroe. He loved American culture, as many Cubans do, and they loved American baseball. Are you telling me they preferred cold Russia? There's 8,000 miles away across the frigid, northern latitudes. You think Cubans have anything to do with their Soviet comrades? Hell no. They wanted American fishermen to come down and fish for marlin, as Ernest Hemingway did. They wanted American trade. We forced them into a more militaristic situation. And I'm kind of being an apologist for the Cuban Revolution, but many of us don't read anything about it. There's a lot of problems with Cuba, and there have been, but we cannot see that in a vacuum. They've managed to survive with ongoing aggression for many, many years, and they wanted to control their means of production. Anyway, long and bald story, but This is, I've gone all over the place. This is probably my longest lecture. You guys are probably tired. It's the end of the semester, but we really have to think a little bit and not let the superstructure, the system of ideology, all that stuff that does our mind control, we can't let that control all of our thinking when we look at something like economics. So anyway, Orozco out. Take care.